Hello Indiamoon family, in this tutorial we are going to cover a couple of handy tools in Python. Specifically, we are going to talk about how to add values into strings using f-strings. Then, we'll talk about single-line if statements. Besides that, we have list comprehensions. Finally, we are going to talk about lambda functions. Understanding them is going to help you a lot to master the language. First of all, here's what we have written in the last video. I want to create a new Python file named tools.py. After that, we can get started with f-strings. I want to have some user information, and this is going to be a string that should be output to a user where we have something like Bob is 10 years old. In this string, Bob and 10 years old should be dynamic. Or, to be a bit more specific, I want to have two more variables, one where we have a username, for example, this could be Bob, and another where we have a user age, which could be 10. Those two values should inform the string for the final output, and f-strings make this process incredibly easy. Although, before we start with that, let's outline the bad way of approaching that, which I am going to store in another variable. Let's call this one the bad approach. Since you can concatenate strings by adding them together, it is quite easy to combine various strings. For example, we could have the username and then add another string with is 10 years old. If I now print the bad approach and run the code, we get Bob is 10 years old. You can see here Bob is written together because in the string there should be one more space. If I now run this again, we get Bob is 10 years old. If we change Bob to, let's say, Anna, then we get Anna is 10 years old. This is working, and to refine this further, we could turn this string into 2 and then inject via a plus symbol the user age in there as well. Like so. Although now if I run this, we are getting an error that we can only concatenate a string, not an integer, to a string. Essentially what we are doing here is we have a string, a number, and a string. The number is what Python is really unhappy about. Although, we can fix all we have to do is turn the user age into a string, and then all of this is going to work just fine. Also, I should remove this 10 years old. Then all of this is going to look much better, and there we go. Now we have Anna is 10 years old, and we can customize Anna and the age. The problem is that this kind of approach is really annoying to work with. Let me just add a comment, this is the bad approach, just to make sure you understand. Instead, what is a much better way of approaching this is to use an f-string. And the idea is before you are creating the string, you write the letter f on its own, and then Python enables a few extra things for a string. They are all accessed via curly brackets inside of the string, and basically, you can add whatever information you want to add. This could be another variable like username, or it could be some kind of calculation. For example, you could have 10 plus 20, and then I want to print the user information. Run all of this, and we get Anna is 30 years old. We have gotten a variable, and we have gotten a calculation inside of a string. Do make sure that you have the f though. If you don't include it, you can see all we get is username in curly brackets and the calculation in curly brackets only. Because of the f-string, does Python calculate these values? In our case, we want to use the username and the user age, and now if I run all of this, we get Anna is 10 years old. And if I change these values to, let's say, 16 and Paul, then we get Paul is 16 years old. And I hope you can see that this kind of approach is significantly better compared to this bad approach. Not only is it shorter, it's also much more readable. Next up, we have single-line if statements. For the example for this one, I want to reuse user age, and let's say we have a user that is 15 years old. We are running some kind of system where we have to determine if the user is an adult or a child, which means we would want to check if user age is, let's say, under 18. Then the user status is going to be a child. If that is not the case, else we want to set the user status to an adult, and depending which status they get different kind of privileges or different kinds of abilities. Doesn't really matter for the example. In this case, all we have to do is print the user status. We get child. If I change the user age to something like 20, run all of this again, we are getting adult. A fairly simple if statement. As a matter of fact, this kind of if statement is so simple. Dedicating 4 lines to it is basically overkill. We could do this much more easily, and for that we have single line if statements. Those are basically if statements for very simple checks. The way you are using them is you are still going to create a variable, and then you want to assign a value. Let's say the default value for this one could be adult, but this value we only want to get if a certain condition is true. In now our case, we want to assign this if the user age is greater or equal to 18. After that we can add or. Rather, we have to add an else statement. If this condition is false, what do we want to do? In our case, we want to assign the value child, and with that we have the exact same logic compared to what we have done on these 4 lines, meaning I can comment them out, run the code again, and we once again get adult. If I change the age back to, let's say, 10 and run this again, we are getting child. The logic still works perfectly fine. What makes this kind of logic even more powerful is that you can combine it quite easily with f strings. For example, if I copied the f string from the earlier example and then print it, now for this one we don't have a username right now. Let's create one really quick. We have a username with Anna, then we have a user ag, and now we want to add one more bit of information. Let's say the per person is e, and then we want to dynamically generate information. Now in there we could add user status. If I run the code, we getting Anna is 10 years old, the person is a child, so that is a pretty good start. But what we can also do is simply get the logic that we have used for the user status and paste it in directly into the curly brackets. If I run the code again, we once again get the exact same outcome. That way you can have really powerful print statements and insert pretty much whatever kind of information you want. And I suppose just to finish off this bit, let me add lowercase letters for all of this. Run it again, then it feels a bit cleaner. Also we should add a dot at the end. But you get the idea. After that, if I comment out everything, we can talk about list comprehension, one of the most powerful tools in all of Python. Basically, imagine we want to create a simple list, and this list should be a list with the values from 0 to 10, meaning 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Typing it out for a simple list is fairly doable, but once again, imagine you have a much larger and more complex project and you have to generate 10,000 lines of code. You couldn't just type that out. Now you can tell Python to generate values. For example, what we could be doing is create a for loop for I in range, and then we can create 10 values, or to use the range function a bit more extensively, we want to go from 0 to 10 and then go at a step size of 1 inside of this for loop. We want to get this simple list and append the I value at the end of all of this. We can print this simple list, run the code, and we are getting the numbers from 0 to 9. Remember, inside of the range function, like with slicing, we only go up to the number, but we are not including it. If you want to go to 10, we have to go up to 11, but not included. And there we go. We are getting the numbers from 0 to 10. That way we are dynamically generating all of these numbers. But this isn't really a good way of doing it, because in Python there's a much better way, which is called list comprehension. Basically what you would be doing is you are a for loop inside of a list. On the line where you are creating that list, we are still going to write for I in range, And then you can define the range, so in this case 0, 11 and 1. Although if I now run all of this, we are getting an error that this is invalid syntax. There's one more bit that we have to add. In our case we have to add an I at the beginning. If I now run all of this, we are once again getting the same numbers. So what happened here? The for part 1 thing is fairly straightforward. We simply have a for loop like the one we have just created. Effectively, I is going to get the values from 0 up to 10. These values are going to be 0, 1, 2 and so on all the way up to 10. The important difference now is this I. This is the part where you can customize the logic. Essentially whatever you are getting returned from this bit before the for part is going to be returned to the list. On the first for loop we are going to return a 0, on the second one a 1, on the third one a 2 and so on, and this is then in the end what will be stored inside of the simple list. For example, what we could be doing is multiply all of these values by 2. Run this again and now we get 0 to 4 and so on. We have essentially cycled through all of the numbers from 0 to 10 and then multiplied the value by 2, and after that we have appended the value to this list. That's all that's happening in here. Especially for this initial bit you can write really complex logic. There's pretty much no end to what you can do. I suppose the one limitation is that all of your code has to be on a single line, but there is a lot of space for what you can write on a single line, although there's actually quite a bit more what you can do. For example, you could add a whole second for loop where we could have something like 4 joules in, and I want to cycle through a toll with the values a, b and c. If I now run the code, we are getting a whole bunch more values, because essentially we have to for loops to understand a bit better what's going on here. In the beginning we are still able to customize the logic, and I want to create an f string where we have first of all the j part, the stuff that we are getting from the second part, and we can add the I part. If I now run this again, you can see we have a 0, b0 and c0, meaning we are first running this for loop and there the first value is going to be 0. After that, we are running the other for loop where we are getting the values a, b and c. Because of that, we are getting a 0, b0 and c0. After that, we are going to the second part where we have a 1, b1 and c1, meaning for the I loop, we got to the value of 1. What you can also do is add an if statement at the end. For example, I only want to append a value if j is equal to I. Let's say a. If I now run this again, we only get the a values because b and c are never going to be the case. I suppose not the most useful example, but you get the idea. This kind of list comprehension you can make incredibly powerful. Although at some point, you want to keep in mind that if this thing becomes too complex, it's going to be really hard to read, and then a simple for loop where you have multiple lines might be much more readable. This is a thing that comes with practice, and at some point, you are going to get an intuition of which one is better. But to get started, being able to read, at the very least, basic list comprehensions is really important. Also, there are other kinds of comprehensions in Python. You could, for example, write a dictionary comprehension. The logic for that isn't all too different, but I want to keep this video at least somewhat focused. As a consequence, let me comment all of this out, and then we come to the final part, which is going to be lambda functions. These are, once again, where we have the basic Python functionality, which is a function, but now we want to write a function that is so simple that it doesn't really merit a whole function. We want to keep the entirety of the logic on a single line of code. For example, let's create a function where we simply want to double a value. This one is going to need one parameter for the number that we want to double, and the only thing that this function is going to do is going to return the number multiplied by 2. With that, if I print double value and insert, let's say, 10, I can now run all of this and we get 20. We have doubled the value. Although this is way too much code for something so simple. What you would rather want to do is to have all of the logic on a single line of code. Once again, The way to approach that, and let me comment out the original function, we want to create a simple variable name. Let's call this, once again, double value, and now we want to assign it a lambda function. And a lambda function is basically a more primitive function that is constrained to a single line of code. The way it works is you are still going to give it a parameter, although this one now is simply going to be a single variable name. Could also be multiple if you separate them by a comma, but in our case, we only have a single variable. Let's call this one num to stay consistent with the previous function. And then we can add the actual operation. In our case, we want to get num and multiply it by 2. What you want to be aware of is that this value, the result of our operation, is going to be returned automatically, which means now I can run this again, and we once again get the very same outcome, meaning this function and this function do the same thing. The logic is basically equivalent, although the second one is much shorter, and I would say a bit easier to read. Although you might argue that you could simply do the operation right away, and you would be correct. This is so simple that you don't even need a function in the first place. However, sometimes there are cases where you absolutely need a function. There are two major cases, actually, where this is going to become important. The first case is that some functions want a function as an argument. Their sort function is the most famous one. Let's say we have a random list where we have some random values. Doesn't really matter what it is. The important thing is that we want to sort this list. For that, we can use sorted. Also, I should organize all of this. The print function should be right after this. The important thing in our case is we want to create a sorted list, and for that, we will use sorted, which wants to have 2 arguments, but at the minimum, we will need a single one. We could simply add the random list in there, and then print the sorted list and get the sorted list from the lowest to the highest value, and there we get the result. This is what's working perfectly fine because by default, sorted is sorting a list by their numerical value, and we are starting from the lowest and going to the highest value. So, this function by itself is quite straightforward. However, now imagine that we have another case where we have a list that contains a couple of tuples where we, for example, have Anna and Anna has a default age of 25. Then we have another tuple with another person, Paul, who has an age of 40. And then we have another user, I don't know, Lisa, who has an age of 10. And we want to sort these tuples by the age of the users. If I now run the code again, we are getting some weird behavior where we get the age of 25, 10, and 40, which is not in the correct order. I think what Python here is trying to do is to sort by the first letter of the name, where we go from A, L, and P. But this isn't what we want to do. For that, we can define another argument inside of the sorted function, and this has to be a named function where we can specify a key. And the key has to be a function. The way all of this is going to work is sorted is going to go through every single item of the list we are providing, and then it passes the value into whatever function we are providing for the key. This could be a normal function or it could be a lambda function. And for that to work, a function has to have a parameter. In this case, let's say the user tuple. And then whatever value is going to be returned is going to be assigned to this tuple or whatever value we provided. And then Python, or rather the sorted function, is going to sort them by this numerical value. So, in our case, we want to look at the user tuple and then use indexing to get the first value, which would be the age. If I now run this again, we are getting the users sorted by age. Just to go over this one really quickly because it can be a bit confusing, we are using the sorted function and passing in the random list, meaning we have 3 tuples that we want to look at, and Python is going to pass every single one of them into the lambda function. The lambda function, in turn, is going to look at the user tuple and 1, which would be the age of these users, which is then the value it is going to return to the sorted function. Sorted is then going to sort them from the lowest to the highest age, which is exactly what we wanted. This is one of the most common ways to use a lambda function where you simply pass it into another function as an argument, to, for example, sort a list. That's slightly more complicated. What you also see fairly often is that when you have a GUI, so a graphical user interface where users can press a button, very often pressing a button should trigger a function, but the function it triggers is very simple. Meaning there you see lambda functions fairly often as well. Although this isn't an example that I can demonstrate quickly here, I did, however, make an introduction to enter in there. I am using lambda functions all the time, so check this one out if you are interested. But anyway, with that, we have covered all of the basic tools that I wanted to cover, which means I can comment out all of this, and then we can do one exercise. What I want you guys to do is to create a list comprehension for a battleship board. This one should be a list that starts at a 1 and ends at E5 with all of the values in between. I want to have the letters from A to E and the numbers from 1 to 5. Also, to make this a bit more difficult, if the value is C3 then simply remove that part. So pause the video now and try to implement this on your own. Back in the code, I want to add an exercise comment where we want to create a battleship board. The associated value for that is going to be a list comprehension. And right after that, I want to print the result. So, battleship board. If I run the code right now, we get an empty list, which is the expected result. So not a bad start. Now we have to figure out what kind of list comprehension we have to create. And I want to start with a letter. So let's say, letter for letter in a tuple with A, B, C, D, and finally E. If I run all of this, we are getting the letters from A to E. By the way, later on, I will show you how to create the entire alphabet from code so you don't have to write all of this by hand. Next up, we will need the second for loop, where we have for num in range, where we want to start at 1 and then go all the way up to but not include 6. You could also add a step size, but since 1 is the default, we can simply keep this one as it is. And with that, I can run all of this again, and we are getting the same letter multiple times. Not a bad start, but not what I want. The reason for that is that we at the moment only return the letter, but this has to be replaced with an F string where we want to get the letter along with the number. Now if we run this, we are getting the values from a 1 all the way to E5. The last thing we have to work on is that if the value is C3 we want to get rid of that value. And for that, we can add an if statement. If and I want to copy the F string. If that value is equal to C3 then we would only get C3. Meaning if I run this, we are only getting C3. In our case, we only want to return that value if the letter is not C3. And for that, we need the exclamation mark along with the equal sign. This is the operator for difference. We only want to get the value if the value is not C3. That way, if I run the code, we are getting the values from C1, C2 and then go to C4. We do not have a C3 which is exactly what we wanted. And that is the exercise, a pretty chunky list comprehension, although in practice they can get more complex, but this is usually what you see as an average. And alright, with that, I hope you get some useful Python tools.